He never imagined that after working hard all day helping his father on the farm, just when he was exhausted and wanted to go home to rest, he was stopped by his mother and not allowed to enter, because his mother did not want Jim to dirty the wooden floor she had just finished cleaning. Jim did not say a single word, and instead rode his horse away from home. At this moment, the young and rebellious him only felt that living in this family was extremely suffocating. He knew that his future life would be helping his father manage the farm, working day after day. After his father passed away, he would take over the farm and continue working day after day. He might even have to marry a woman like his mother, who would keep him from entering the house just to protect the wooden floor. So he began to think about escaping from his parents and living an independent life. It was at this time that two of his close friends encouraged him to join the army and make a name for himself. They believed that as a man, the battlefield was the dream they were meant to pursue. So that evening, Jim asked his father for permission to leave home and enlist in the military. But how could his father possibly let him go so easily? Not only because the farm needed Jim's help to manage it, but more importantly because his father understood the cruelty and ruthlessness of war, and he did not want to watch his only son lose his life there. But the young and rebellious Jim could not understand his father's good intentions, and in the end the father and son parted on bad terms. That night, Jim left a farewell letter for his father, quietly stepped out of the house, and prepared to go enlist with his friends. But he did not expect that his father had already sensed his intentions, and the moment he stepped out the door, his father blocked his way. His father once again tried to persuade Jim to give up the idea of joining the army, but Jim, who had already made up his mind, simply lowered his head in silence. Seeing that Jim's decision could not be changed, his father could only take out his most beloved pipe and give it to him, praying that he would return safely. After a short period of military training, Jim arrived at the European front line with his two friends, looking at the aid station that was always crowded with wounded soldiers, and then at the ever-increasing number of graves for the fallen. Jim suddenly realized that war seemed nothing like he had imagined, or rather, he had never truly understood war before. Soon, Jim's unit received orders to move to the front line trenches and take over the position, stepping on the muddy ground, carrying a mix of nervousness, fear, and a hint of excitement. Jim began heading toward the first battlefield of his life. By the time they arrived at the trenches, night had already fallen. Under the guidance of veteran soldiers, they quickly moved toward their respective defensive positions. Jim had just arrived at his post when a veteran came over and said he would take a few new recruits to collect barbed wire from in front of the German positions. Without any hesitation, Jim signed up along with his two friends and another new recruit. Before setting out, the veteran carefully shared his experience with them, doing everything he could to extend these recruits' chances of surviving on the brutal battlefield. Then the four recruits followed the veteran as they slowly approached the German positions. Soon, the group began their tense and hurried work. Because Jim had hunted with his father since childhood and was an excellent marksman, he stayed with the veteran to handle lookout and defense. However, one of the companions behind him, nervous from his first mission, accidentally made a noise. In the next second, several flares shot up into the sky from the German positions. Following the veterans' earlier instructions, they all froze in place and did not move at all, only resuming their tense work after the flares burned out. At that moment, several gunshots suddenly rang out from the enemy position. The frightened recruits immediately dropped down to hide, while the veteran remained completely still, because he knew these were only random probing shots without a clear target. The recruits had just gotten back up to continue their task when they suddenly noticed two figures slowly approaching them from not far ahead. Panicked, Jim quickly asked the veteran beside him what they should do. Because they were carrying out a mission at that moment and could not fire to expose their position, the veteran slowly put down the rifle in his hands and quickly pulled out the bayonet from his waist. Jim, a new recruit on his first mission, immediately followed the veteran's example, putting down his gun and forcefully drawing his bayonet. Then the veteran began counting down with his fingers, preparing to launch a sudden attack on the two German soldiers. At the moment the countdown ended, Jim suppressed the panic in his heart and charged at the enemy without hesitation. He tackled the German soldier to the ground, but failed to kill him. The other man also seemed to be a new recruit, with no intention of fighting, only desperately trying to run back to the German position. Jim seized the opportunity, picked up his bayonet, and grabbed the German soldier, just as he was about to cut the man's throat with the blade. Facing such close combat for the first time, he could not bring himself to do it. Seeing this, the German soldier quickly raised his hands and surrendered to Jim, already unable to go through with it. Jim hesitated for a moment and ultimately chose to let him go. The German soldier immediately took the chance and ran for his life. When the veteran realized that Jim had let the enemy go, he instantly panicked and ordered everyone to retreat at once. But just as the veteran stood up, a fatal bullet pierced through his chest. In the very next second, the machine guns from the German position began to sweep wildly toward Jim and the others. After the veteran was killed, the remaining recruits fell into chaos, and all they could do was desperately run back toward their own lines. One of the friends who had enlisted with Jim was struck by bullets and collapsed on the ground, watching his childhood friend die right before his eyes. Jim was instantly overwhelmed with anger and despair. Another friend hurriedly pulled him to keep running, but in the next second, a shell exploded behind them. The other friend who had enlisted with him since childhood also fell forever in front of Jim. At this moment, Jim was completely losing control, and in grief he roared as he got up and ran toward his own position. Fortunately, he managed to make it back alive. Jim never imagined that on his very first day at the front, his two best friends would both be taken from him like this, and the one responsible for their deaths turned out to be himself. Only then did he truly realize the cruelty and helplessness of war. Not long after returning to the trench, Jim was summoned to the officer's bunker to report the details of the mission. Although Jim knew that releasing the German soldier had led to the entire squad being wiped out, he still reported everything truthfully without hiding anything. Fortunately, the kind-hearted officer did not mention a single word in the report about Jim letting the enemy go, allowing him to avoid military punishment. Even though Jim escaped punishment, he could not escape the torment of guilt within himself. He hid in a deserted corner, holding the pipe his father had given him before he enlisted. Thinking back to his father's warnings when he tried to stop him from joining the army, an overwhelming regret began to take root deep inside his heart. But no matter how much he regretted it, he had no choice now, because leaving the army at this moment would make him a deserter, and the consequences during wartime were extremely severe. With no way out, he could only remain here and endure the suffering day after day. But this was only his first day at the front, and he could not imagine how he would survive the long torment ahead. Jim crouched in the trench, his whole body trembling. He had been soaked in the rain all night, yet even the rain could not wash away the guilt and shame inside him, because his moment of mercy the night before had led to the entire squad being lost, leaving him as the only survivor. After hesitating again and again, he finally gathered the courage to stand before Ned and confess his mistake, because among the fallen soldiers was Ned's own younger brother. No matter how sincerely Jim apologized, there was no way Ned could forgive him so easily. Consumed by grief and anger, Ned shouted at him relentlessly, even preparing to take action and punish him for his brother's death. Fortunately, the soldiers nearby stepped in to stop him, and Jim narrowly avoided being beaten. A few days later in the afternoon, Ned, who had lost his brother, was selected along with several other soldiers to capture a prisoner from a German machine gun position under the cover of night. In order to make up for his past mistake, Jim also volunteered to join this dangerous mission. Knowing the tension between Ned and Jim, the sergeant turned to glance at Ned. After a few seconds of silence, Ned calmly said that one more person meant one more helping hand. From that moment on, the relationship between Jim and Ned began to subtly change. Soon night fell, and before setting out, the experienced sergeant explained the detailed plan to them. Then the sergeant personally led the team as they slowly approached the German position. The enemy seemed to sense something unusual and began firing probing shots. Looking at the enemy machine guns spitting fire, Jim felt as if he had been dragged back to that night when his entire squad was lost. An overwhelming panic surged through him again. Fortunately, the experienced sergeant noticed something was wrong and quickly pulled him back to reality. Then they continued to follow the sergeant, slowly crawling toward the German position. When they got close enough to the machine gun nest, the sergeant gave the order, and everyone immediately rushed forward. Caught off guard by the sudden attack, several German soldiers were eliminated before they could react. They successfully captured a German machine gunner alive as a prisoner. Then the group quickly withdrew with the captive. Before leaving, they also took the German machine gun with them. After finally bringing the captured German soldier back to their position, an interrogation revealed that he was just a new recruit who had only been on the battlefield for a few days and knew nothing of value. Although the mission turned out to be in vain, Jim managed to earn the recognition of the sergeant and the others through this operation. More importantly, Ned, who had always resented him, showed a noticeable change in attitude. A few days later, they finally got the chance to rotate out and leave the front line, but before they could even depart, a sudden and violent artillery barrage swept over them. One soldier was unfortunately hit by a shell and lay on the ground crying out in pain. Kind-hearted Jim comforted the wounded man while preparing to carry him to the aid station, but the sergeant beside him advised him not to waste his effort, because the experienced sergeant knew that the soldier had no chance of survival, and there was no need to make him suffer more pain from being moved before his death. Ned, who had remained silent toward Jim until now, finally spoke and told him that the man had no chance to live, and it would be better to let him pass away quietly here. But the stubborn Jim still insisted on taking the wounded soldier to chase that impossible hope of survival. With no other choice, the sergeant had to approve Jim's request. Then Jim and another soldier carried the wounded man and rushed toward the aid station. When they finally arrived, Jim discovered that the place was filled with wounded soldiers crying out in agony. In order to get his comrade treated as soon as possible, he ran up to a nurse and pleaded desperately, but the nurse calmly told him to take his comrade over there and wait. Hearing this, Jim was stunned. He never expected that someone devoted to saving lives could speak such cold words so calmly. But if conditions allowed, the nurse would have wanted to save every wounded soldier here. Yet faced with such overwhelming casualties every day, she was powerless. In the end, she handed Jim some morphine and told him to ease his comrade's pain first. Disappointed, Jim slowly turned around and walked back toward his suffering companion. With no other option, they could only stay by his side and watch as he gradually stopped breathing. After a short rest, Jim returned to the front line with his unit once again. A few days later, one morning as they were about to have breakfast, they suddenly heard someone calling for help not far away. Kind-hearted Jim immediately stood up and looked out, only to see a soldier trapped in barbed wire and unable to escape. Just as Jim was about to climb out of the trench to rescue the unfamiliar soldier, the experienced Ned suddenly stopped him. Ned did not want to watch him climb out in broad daylight and risk his life for nothing, and he told Jim that the reason the enemy had not shot the trapped soldier was to lure them out for a rescue and then take them down. Hearing Ned's warning, Jim slowly stepped back and prepared to continue eating, but the trapped soldier kept shouting for help. Time passed second by second. In the end, Jim could not ignore it and decided to climb out and take the risk. He handed all the letters he had written to his family to a nearby comrade, then stood up without hesitation and prepared to rush toward the trapped soldier, but Ned grabbed him and pulled him back. Although Jim had unintentionally caused the death of Ned's brother on his first day at the front, Ned understood that it had not been deliberate. As a veteran, he did not want to see Jim throw his life away like this. No matter how he tried to persuade him, Jim still insisted on going. Seeing that Ned refused to let him go, Jim paused for a moment and said that if the trapped soldier were your brother, what would you do? Hearing this, Ned slowly loosened his grip. Jim climbed out of the trench alone and slowly moved toward the trapped soldier. Fortunately, the battlefield was covered in smoke, blocking the enemy's view. Under the cover of the smoke, he successfully reached the trapped soldier, but while he was removing the barbed wire, the soldier cried out in pain. In the next second, the enemy position began firing scattered probing shots. Luckily, the bullets did not hit them. After an unknown amount of time, Jim finally freed the soldier. He immediately supported him and ran back toward the trench. In the end, he successfully brought the man back to their position. When the sergeant learned that Jim had risked his life to save a trapped soldier, he came over and praised him highly. Ned was also deeply moved by Jim's kindness. At this moment, he had completely forgiven Jim for the accidental death of his brother. From then on, he and Jim became close friends who could talk about anything. But this was not the end of their story. It was only the beginning, and what awaited them was an even more brutal and difficult future. Jim suddenly grabbed a handful of snow and threw it at Ned. Ned immediately turned and glared at him. In the next second, the two of them, worn down by the battlefield, suddenly became like carefree children and started a playful snowball fight in the trench. Just as Ned turned to grab more snow, a deadly bullet suddenly flew toward him. Fortunately, it narrowly missed him. The sudden gunshot instantly pulled them back from their brief moment of joy into harsh reality. Realizing the danger, they quickly got up to move. Sure enough, just as they stood, several shells came whistling down from the sky and landed nearby. Once again, they survived purely by luck. At that moment, Jim finally realized that once on the battlefield, happiness no longer belonged to him. That afternoon, they noticed an unexploded shell near the enemy position. To relieve the boredom of battlefield life, they took turns firing at it, but because it was too far away, no one could hit it. Jim, who had hunted with his father since childhood, managed to detonate it with a single shot. His impressive performance immediately drew cheers from everyone, but before the laughter could fade, Jim heard continuous and intense artillery fire from the enemy position. To retaliate for the explosion and the damage it caused, the enemy launched a fierce bombardment. Realizing what was happening, They panicked and scattered to take cover. In the next second, shell after shell came screaming toward them. Before the bombardment ended, Ned suddenly noticed that one of their comrades had been buried under dirt. They immediately rushed out of cover despite the danger and began digging frantically. While digging, they told Jim to go find a shovel. Jim turned at once and ran through the trench under heavy fire, searching for a shovel. But just as he was carrying the shovel and preparing to rescue his comrade, he was suddenly stopped by a soldier. The soldier pleaded that his younger brother was buried under the dirt and begged Jim to help him. With no other choice, Jim stopped and helped the stranger rescue his brother. After helping him pull his brother out, Jim immediately got up again with the shovel and rushed to save his own comrade. But when he arrived, he discovered that the others had already dug the man out, and he had become a lifeless body that would never wake again. Filled with grief and anger, Ned slowly turned to look at Jim, who had arrived late. He demanded to know why finding a shovel had taken him so long. Jim could only tell him the truth about what had just happened. The moment he heard this, Ned completely lost his temper. He stood up, grabbed Jim, and shouted angrily, asking why he would abandon a comrade he fought beside every day just to save a stranger. He said that Jim was not a god and could not save everyone. He accused Jim of causing his brother's death and now causing the death of another comrade who had fought alongside him. At this moment, Ned was almost out of control, and the two of them struggled in the mud for a long time. Because of fighting on the battlefield, they were punished with 2 weeks of deducted pay and an additional week of hard labor. Still immersed in the grief of losing their comrade, they picked up shovels and began a week of labor. As they dug, they suddenly unearthed a human skull. The sight of the skull instantly reminded them of the comrade who had just been buried alive under the dirt. Already overwhelmed with grief, they lost the strength to continue digging, but as soldiers, they had no right to choose. After a long pause, they forced themselves to stand up and continue. Jim had endured more than a year on the battlefield, and he had grown from an inexperienced recruit into a seasoned soldier. At that moment, Jim received a letter from Australia. His sister told him that after he left home to join the army, their father had struggled alone to manage the farm and had fallen ill from exhaustion, passing away half a month earlier. She also told Jim that before their father died, he kept calling out his name. At that moment, Jim's heart shattered completely. He thought back to how his father had tried so hard to stop him from enlisting. He thought about how, after joining the army, he would hold the pipe his father gave him and regret his decision every day. He had believed that after the war ended, he could return home, apologize in person, and take care of the farm seriously. But before the war even ended, his father had already left him forever. An overwhelming wave of guilt and regret swept over him. But no matter how much he blamed himself, he would never have the chance to apologize again. At that moment, an alarm suddenly sounded, and everyone immediately rushed to their battle positions. Jim quickly wiped away his tears, stood up, and picked up his rifle. In the face of war, even grief became a luxury they could not afford. Soon, waves of enemy soldiers charged endlessly toward Jim's defensive position. Jim turned the sorrow of losing his father into one deadly shot after another, cutting down the advancing enemy. In order to capture the position, the enemy began launching gas shells at them. With no other option, they were forced to retreat temporarily. But during the retreat, Jim suddenly noticed that one of his comrades was missing. Without hesitation, he climbed out of the trench and returned to search for him. Sure enough, the man had been shot and was lying there in pain. Jim grabbed him and used all his strength to support him as they retreated. But just as they were about to jump back into the trench, the man was struck again by a bullet. Jim kept encouraging him to hold on. The dying soldier looked at Jim with fear in his eyes and weakly said that he wanted to go home. With no way to save him, Jim watched another comrade slip away. Back then, the four of them had played in the trench like children, throwing snow at each other. They had even promised that after the war, they would all go to Jim's farm and run it together, sharing both hardship and life. But now, in the blink of an eye, only Jim and Ned remained. Time passed slowly as they mourned their fallen comrades. Before they knew it, it was already Jim's 773rd day on the European front. That afternoon, they received orders for a full-scale assault. The officer loudly encouraged the soldiers, saying that if they bravely charged into the enemy trench, the defenders would immediately surrender, and they could end the war and return home to their families. Jim remained silent as he listened. Having survived countless battles, he knew that such encouragement only meant the attack would be extremely dangerous and costly. He turned to look at Ned. After more than 2 years of war, Ned was his only remaining close friend. Ned looked back at him, and neither of them spoke, as if exchanging a silent farewell. The next second, the signal for the assault sounded. and all the soldiers climbed out of the trench, shouting as they charged forward. Explosions erupted around them one after another. Though fear filled their hearts, they had no choice but to run forward with all their strength, praying they would reach the enemy trench alive. Even though the distance was less than 200 meters, it felt like an endless and agonizing journey. Fortunately, Jim made it into the trench, but the enemy soldiers did not surrender as the officer had claimed, instead fighting desperately in close combat. The battle in the trench raged on for a long time with no clear victor. It was one of the fiercest battles Jim had ever experienced in over 2 years of war. After an unknown period of time, they finally captured the first line of defense. Nearly half of Jim's unit had been lost in the fight, but Jim and Ned both survived. They followed the sergeant to take cover in a corner, hoping to rest, but a messenger suddenly arrived with orders to continue the attack toward the second line, leaving the enemy no time to recover. The sergeant could only smile bitterly and tell them that the second line was less than 50 meters away, so they would all make it home alive. Then he led them forward again. They continued shouting and charging as more soldiers fell one after another. Ned was knocked down during the advance and then thrown aside by a shell. Jim rushed over, saw how badly he was hurt, and tried to carry him away, but he was struck by a bullet. At that moment, Ned finally realized that survival was the most important thing. He quietly told Jim that they should lie there and wait for the battle to end, because maybe that was the only way to make it home alive. Jim said nothing and instead used a mirror to observe the battlefield. He saw that all the soldiers who had charged with them were gone. Only then did he realize they were completely surrounded. They could have waited for nightfall to crawl back, but Jim knew Ned's injuries were too severe to last that long, so he turned back, raised his rifle, and continued firing. He told himself that no matter what, he would bring Ned back alive, even if it cost him his life. At that moment, another wave of soldiers launched an attack. Jim seized the opportunity and carried Ned back with all his strength. He finally managed to get him back to safety, but he chose to return to the fight. Before leaving, he apologized to Ned again for the death of his brother and for everything he had done that caused him pain. Then he stood up once more and charged forward, but he did not make it to the trench. As he was struck down again midway, he lay on the ground, crying out in pain until his strength faded away. In his fading consciousness, he saw his father. He saw all the suffering and happiness he had experienced. He saw the comrades who had left him one by one. He saw the moment when the war finally ended, and he saw himself returning home to reunite with his family.